Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Jinnah Institute's series of webinars. This time we're going to talk about an issue that we have looked at for very many years from a whole host of angles. And we are not comforted by what we are looking at, is the issue of extremism in Pakistan, which is acquiring a whole new intensity. And whether we may call it generational extremisms that are conditioned by young people who have had economic disadvantage, whether that be the case, whether they are inspired by wars occurring in different contexts, whether this is a symptom of, state asks not being met or entitlements not being given. There are very many causal issues and reasons that we have looked at, none of whom may provide a full explanation for what we are seeing, the intensity of lynchings that happen, the sheer disregard of the rule of law that occurs. And of course, the way our minorities continue to be marginalized, continue to be predated by the majority, is now acquiring an intensity that neither state nor society can fully tackle. What we'd like to talk about today is perhaps the solutions that have worked, have not worked, for reasons of scalability or timelines or resources. But all the same, it is important to go back to the solutions we know and the answers that we may have had. There are also answers or options that we cannot fully exercise as we proceed. Pakistan continues to change at a rapid pace. The political changes, the socio-economic changes that are coming up may not be controllable by governments that sit in Islamabad. And of course, there are democratic deficits that occur all over the place. And on top of that, there's the story of weak state penetration. I'm very happy to have with us an excellent panel today, which has Dr. A.H. Nayyar, renowned physicist and veteran human rights defender who's looked at issues of extremism for a very long time. Jennifer Jivan Sahiba, who's the former executive director of the Christian Study Center and also a renowned human rights activist. Mr. Saroop Ijaz, who is now associated with the Human Rights Watch, has been writing and is a legal expert on many issues of national importance. I welcome all of you to the webinar. Dr. Nayyar Saab, if we could start with you, sir. Sir, there is this tendency among our youth to be violent. There is a tendency in our people to turn into mobs very soon. We have seen incident after incident where the state has not stepped in, where the police are unable to, prevent a tragedy from happening. The tragedy invariably happens. It requires a more and more gruesome picture every time. We are constantly shocked, but we find ourselves unable to respond. Why is this happening and what can we do?
Well, I think the state is partially to be blamed or mainly to be blamed because the state has, in fact, it had an agenda to create this kind of feeling among our young people. There was a time, I think it was about 1985 or so, when we started to see the Islamization of education. And we noted at that particular time in an article that towards the turn of the century, you will see a lot of manifestations and of this radicalization in various forms. And I think this turned out to be true. And also, we also know that at the turn of the century, we also had this new phenomenon of intervention by the US into Pakistan's education by radicalizing it, by trying to introduce things which went in favor of its agenda in Afghanistan. So there was a lot of this work that was done on the young of Pakistan at that time. Now, this was 20 years ago. So the students who were studying at that time are now perhaps beyond 40 years of age, 35 to 40 years of age. And we are talking about actually, as you said, in much younger students militant behavior. And I think this is because that particular thing is continuously, it just exists. It is continuing to exist, and it is something which is now, for example, in the new curriculum that the government has brought in, there is much more of radicalization, there is much more of Islamization than there was before. Although they think that they have removed hate material from the curriculum and textbooks, which perhaps is partially true, but then they create the kind of feeling among students through a larger amount of religious education that gives them a sense in which they become completely intolerant towards anything which is not themselves, which they think is wrong. And then, of course, the state has played politics with the religion in various sense. It created a number of groups, including the Tehreek-e-Labbaik. But then after that, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan was, in fact, there were various instances where Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan was seen to be an organ that is, under the influence of the state and was working for the state. And that actually had created a large number of radical feelings among people. Tehreek-e-Labbaik was the one which actually has this slogan of, Sartan se juda kind of a thing. And they are the ones who create this. There are two things that they create. Number one, that anybody who, any blasphemy should not be tolerated. And therefore, an action by any individual will benefit that individual in the hereafter. And therefore, that kind of thing is, although that has now been stated by the Islamic Ideology Council to be not true, but still that is there in the minds of people. And secondly, they have, they're strongly anti-Ahmadi, and they would like Ahmadis to be sort of tormented to a level where they completely disappear from the society. That kind of feeling, that kind of campaign that went on with Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan has sort of seeped into the minds of people. And I think what we see is a result of all of that. And although the government then claimed that to have created NACTA and to have created an agenda for de-radicalization and so on and so forth, but I don't think de-radicalization or the actions of NACTA can work in an environment where the state at the same time supports such elements like this. This is all before us.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. You've laid a very good ground in terms of pointing out institutional impulse in fomenting this kind of psychology, if you like. I'd like to refer that to Jennifer Jagjeevan Sahiba. There is a definite psychology at work here. And we are seeing radicalized groups, but we are also seeing everyday people come together and respond as they do to incidents, to slogans, and turn into mobs very fast. What could you reflect on the psychology behind how this happens and why it happens?
I think when we are talking about crowd violence or mob violence, because when mobs turn violent, generally mobs have this capacity of turning violent. Otherwise, then they are just crowds in itself, people gatherings, and they are assembled for certain things. I think we also have to differentiate that there is mob violence, not necessarily where death occurs, but you see it and it is taking place incident upon incident when, for instance, a Hindu temple is being constructed in the capital. And then suddenly a crowd comes and sees that it's no longer being constructed and the government has to retreat back. Or a church is being burnt down, not necessarily where people are being lynched, but this is also coming in in violence, and mob violence, when the mob takes whatever they are planning to do and they think that they are the implementers of whatever justice they think is right. So there is this psychology, and the psychology is erupting from the otherness, which is carried out to the extreme. So be it the otherness in terms of gender, be it otherness in terms of religious minorities, be it in terms of political ideologies. So there is a clash and you will see this violence erupting. And the violence is erupting. The result is when the state does not take its responsibility. And we come back to the question, why does the state not take this responsibility, although it has the infrastructure available? And then we also see politics at play. This whole dynamics of politics is also attached to it. At the individual level, psychologists tend to say it starts from the family level, of how the parents are responding and what is being taught over there, and what is this kind of stories. So it's not just the curriculum that a person goes to school. We have seen people, for instance, in Sialkot, they might not have been radicalized from that angle, but that level of intolerance which has changed that otherness to that extreme level that they forget who they are, because it's very, very easy in a violent crowd that you lose your personal identity and you begin to identify with the crowd, with the leader. And violence, mob crowds and all, it's always identified with fear, with emotions. And if you will look, whether it is our curriculum or whether we hear sermons or khutbas, they are generally emotionally charged. Why after the Friday prayers, then the protest starts, where people are already gathered? So I guess it's easy for people because they already gathered so that they can walk about, but also like in sermons, be it Christian sermons or be anywhere in the world. So so they already have that platform. And it is over here that at the personal level, you see this. When I was reading this article of the psychologist, and I was thinking of the person who tried to save the Sri Lankan. And the psychologist is saying at the personal level, when there is a lot of mob violence going on, it is only at the personal level where you have to reject all that is going on. And that is a very difficult task. Out of those hundreds of people, only one or two tried to stop that lynching or that killing. And it is here that towards the solutions, which are being often suggested, is that because these aspects take place in the community, they take place very raw in the streets of any city, anywhere in the world. So the community, has the community been trained in terms of how to deal with conflicts? And again, it comes back to the very personal level, at the school level, at your community level, family level. Are we ready to listen? Has that been implanted in us as a society? And here the societal shortfalls and shortcomings come into play. Have we been trained to try to resolve our issues? In which manner? And when it is fueled by a state, and I'm not saying necessarily that the state might be fueling it, but when they fail to take actions trying to address it, and they're giving in, then there is absolute lawlessness. And this is one of the results. So whether it be coming from people who are extremists or radicalized, or people who just become emotionally charged because of their economic frustrations or other frustrations.
I think those are all very important trends and questions as well that we will pick apart. And some of this acquires an institutional frame. Some of this, of course, relates to what communities, what capacity they have, or how vulnerable they are. And of course, there is a gradation of certain communities being more vulnerable than others in Pakistan. I'd like to refer this to Saroop Ijaz. Saroop, there's, of course, a dichotomy within the state as well. There is a part of the state that at some point benefited from a strategic or even a tactical position on having extremists in the country. There are also solutions that generate within the state by institutions of the state that acquire legal forms. And if you could tell us what the legal challenges are in dealing with extremism, I think it'll help us, take this conversation a little forward in terms of what solutions have worked and what hasn't worked.
Sure. Of course, I mean, in terms of the challenges, if we start with the legal challenges, some of those are very obvious. We have, as Dr. Nayyar was saying in his remarks, that the Pakistan legal system, like the education system he's mentioning, was very deliberately engineered, tinkered with throughout, but starting with the process at an accelerated pace in the 1980s, which meant at a fundamental level, before sort of going into the granular level of what particular legal problems, many of those very well documented, which meant, or did one thing, in my opinion, the primary sin, the original sin in some of this conversation, which was that it violated the principle of equal citizenship on occasions. And that for a democracy, that for a modern progressive democracy, is a constitutional framework, is a fatal mistake. And when you have tiers of citizenship, and that manifests itself, as Jennifer was saying, in other ways, then that's not restricted. One lesson that we've learned from our legal misadventures, and of course, states, policy, and societal mistakes, that islands of persecution, islands of hatred, and islands of exclusion do not work. You cannot do it to a sect, you cannot do it to a particular group of people. This is an expansionist project, and this is so otherization of religious minorities, of minorities, of sectarian minorities, of women, and that is this part of a larger framework in that sense. So the legal system in Pakistan, I think has problems or has failed at both levels: at the level of principle, at the level of the laws itself, and the level of the implementation of those laws. But one example that we can look at, I think a concrete example, is the example of blasphemy law. The justification for the Pakistani blasphemy law, the increase in enhancement in punishment for the blasphemy law, was that it will prevent mob violence. It was in the 1980s. It was the punishments were raised so to prevent people from taking law into their own hands. And if we look at the data, how that has played out is exactly the opposite. What it has led to is more mob violence. So the relationship between the law and societal action is dialectical, because what people saw from that was a moral, ethical, if not illegal, but a moral, ethical legitimacy to violence if they think somebody has done something that they considered, or the Pakistani law considered, blasphemous. So that's one fundamental problem. There is, when it's as I to borrow from Dr. Nayyar, what the education system does, the same thing, I think sometimes it's even a more amplified level, the legal system does. It provides justification in the minds, in the consciousness, in the subconscious of individuals, of groups, of an entire people, of what the punishment it is. And then sometimes it becomes secondary if that punishment is carried out with a due process or not. But at a fundamental level, if we go back to the larger picture of this, and you said, I mean, the state has a complicated role here. The Pakistani state, for example, has fought the TTP in a very bloody battle, and has incurred great losses, both Pakistani civilians and armed forces. And we've seen kinetic successes, and we've seen on the kinetic bits, we have seen successes, and on the non-kinetic bits, we've seen failures. So what that means is, to look at these conflicts, to look at the conflict itself as time-bound, as area-bound, as from a strategic tactical sense, misses the war for the battle. There was an example of the TLP. One primary problem that we're now seeing with the TLP, even if we put aside the origin story, etc., is the state's strategy of dealing with a group like TLP or similar groups, is to fall back onto religion, is to say that we are more religious than you are. We are more Muslims than you are, which one can understand the impulse to reclaim religion for the state itself. But what that means, again, this is an incremental expansionist game. Not to do it in the language of law and order, not to do it in the language of the writ of the state. So that's one problem where we've seen that, because the next round would mean that every time you do this, you cede space. They come one step forward, you go one step back. And you can continue doing this and you hit a wall. Second is with I think you said in the introductory remarks, with the TLP, again, as an example, there are other examples. But, and I think it's linked to mob violence as well. It has become incredibly empowering in a political space where all other kinds of protest and organization activity is prohibited, where trade unions are prohibited or clamped down on, where labor unions are clamped down on, student unions are not allowed, where all kinds of collectivization of public life, which does not happen in the name of religion, is clamped down on. And then it becomes incredibly empowering to find a slogan where the SHO, the ASI, the state itself, which is beyond your reach, which would not let protesting clerks or lady health workers stand for 5 minutes outside the press club. So suddenly that power relation is inverse. Suddenly those public spaces in ghettoized cities that we live in is inverse, where and so they get to police that. So there is a larger, what I think, there is a curriculum problem, there is a legal system problem, there is a political will problem, and then, but it's all, you cannot divorce it, where religion has become the only language which gets you heard, which makes the state not only listen to you, but often cede to you. And that sends a message. That's so I claim no insight into great insight into psychology, but a mob which is doing it in the name of religion in Sialkot or elsewhere, did at the back of the mind feel that we're not doing this. This is not an anti-state thing that we're doing. There is legitimacy to this. And that's a problem. And that problem, how we move from this, I think we've seen attempts, there's Paygam-e Pakistan, there's example of Nectar. But as I said, you cannot deal with these things in silos. There is a value, and there's a technical conversation about de-radicalization. There's a technical conversation to have about legal reform and educational reform. But there's also the overarching political structure where unless a state which is willing and able to work for a tolerant, inclusive, pluralistic state, has to reclaim, amongst other things, religion, and also has to allow, enable, encourage the transaction of politics, of social and public life in languages, in idioms, in slogans, in organizations other than religion, for people to find areas of solidarity and commonality other than religion. So that would, as I said, it's a long conversation, and many of the things have already been said, and all people here are perhaps more aware of them than I am.
Thank you, Saroop. Those are incredibly useful insights. And what I find to be a key observation is that um, there is a deliberate choice in who the state chooses to police, who it chooses to protect, and the creation of legitimacy, foundations of legitimacy, where these foundations can come into clash. My legitimacy might, feel more justified than yours, and turn violent on any given day. I'd like to, there's several complexities here. There is a complexion of the state. There is a historical movement within the state. Uh, the state is at once liberal and parts of it are arch conservative. So between the mess that states and societies can become and the violence and conflicts that are symptomatic of breakdowns, of neglect, of extremisms that are contained within this mess. There are, of course, no easy answers, but there have been moves, as Saroop was saying, as everybody else has said. There have been moves to resolve some of this. Dr. Nayyar, could I ask you what solutions you have seen in universities, for example, where there is a lot of extremism in our seats of learning? What solutions have universities, come to in resolving some of this? Sir, you're on mute. You could unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry, I was saying that in universities, there has not been any attempt at trying to modify curriculum, trying to modify lectures and so on. No, I think what has worked in universities is when stern actions against lawlessness. You say that if there is a lawlessness committed by someone, if actions are not taken, stern actions are not taken, then those actions will happen again and again. And therefore, what people have seen to work is when a very stern action is taken at lawlessness. This is precisely what doesn't happen in the case of mob actions, in the case of these religious actions, and so on. For example, mullahs now are much more powerful than they were some 50 years ago or 60 years ago. I mean, they existed at that time too, but now they are much more powerful. You saw how they challenged the state during the time of General Pervez Musharraf. They would not let any encroachment on state land by a mosque be challenged. Well, that was the starting point of all of that disturbance. Plus, then they actually challenged the state from the middle of the capital Islamabad, from a mosque. And that mosque, the action against the leaders of that mosque was not, in the sense, of course, there was a fight, and in the fight, one of the two brothers was killed, and perhaps the mother was also killed. But then the act of defiance was enormous, to allow hundreds of fighters live in that mosque, fully armed, to have imported so much of arms and ammunition inside the mosque to be able to challenge, the elite brigades of the armed forces, and to kill 11 of those armed forces personnel. So this actually was a huge challenge. And of course, many of them were killed, but those who were responsible for it were not punished. That mullah is still there. And that mullah was given a land to make another madrasa somewhere else. Even now in Islamabad, that particular lane is cordoned off by police 24 hours, 7 days a week, where nobody can pass through that street, because that adjoins that particular mosque. And some months ago, on some occasion, that mullah came out with a gun and stood outside and said that, I will start fighting the state again if such and such demands are not met. And that thing goes on with every mullah, including the mullah who, the mullahs who killed policemen and rangers people in Lahore and in Rawalpindi. So there is no action against them. The mullahs are much, much more powerful. And that sends a message to people. That sends a message to people that perhaps these mullahs are right. Perhaps what they're doing is right, and because no action was taken against them, if we do that, no action will be taken against us. So there is no deterrent against mob actions, against illegal actions. So, I mean, the NACTA was formed and said we will make a counter narrative. There's a narrative going on and we make a counter narrative. What counter narrative when your narratives continue to deteriorate, continue to go bad to worse? Take the example of this curriculum nowadays. I mean, the new curriculum that has come up, I mean, we are talking of this, this is the most recent thing, is full of such narratives, which is going to tell people that things will have to be seen from, everything will have to be seen from the point of view of religion. And therefore the mullah is the authority. And because mullah says so, and mullah brings up the issues of anti-Ahmadi slogans again and again. I mean, look at the amount of legislation which has come during the last 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 years actually. First, Nazla Quran to be completed, then Quran with Tarjuma completed, then Arabic to be taught, then Quran to be taught throughout the studies, and so many of those things, one after the other, as if all education is incomplete without these religious things. So mullah is empowered. Mullah is the person who is now authorized to look at textbooks and tell you which thing is to be allowed and which is not to be allowed. So mullah has been empowered so much that it now is difficult to push him back to his original position. And that is the tragedy of this nation, that this nation is now becoming hostage at the hands of mullah. And I think that is the thing that the state must think for the first thing that the state must do is to put the mullah back into where he belongs, not give him any more space as is happening now.
Thank you, sir. Jennifer Saiba, states or governments are really seen to be seats of wisdom or encompass as much power as we sometimes think they do. There are also opportunities or that remain with civil society groups, with communities, and you referred to this at the beginning. What, in your view, are some effective solutions that communities can undertake, or civil society groups, as they are at once the victims of extremism, but also sometimes participants in it? What solutions can you recommend?
Let me give you some of my own personal examples. Formally, I've been working for interfaith relations since 1995 and continue to do so to date. And so we've worked with grassroots communities, mid-level communities, and we've gone into, interior Punjab, different places all over the country. And I have always to date, so when we formulated programs for organizations, when we've carried it out ourselves, from the Maulanas to the local community members, lawyers, teachers, youth, women, university students, you name it, we've always found positive results when we have worked on the principles of interfaith harmony. It is about, to date, I have never seen anyone go back. And we know, which we do not then disclose the names for various reasons, that when in so many cases, when in those areas where we have worked and community relations have been strong, when people have been accused of blasphemy, they've been accused of many other things, but because blasphemy is something that triggers everything, the Muslim community, be it the local religious leader or the lawyers or journalists of that area, the stories haven't even been broken out, and they have come forward and they have settled matters and they have worked together. So my own personal experience is when things are handled in a way of relationship building, and it's not just one workshop and all, you continue to work at that level, and people, when you give communities, when you give people alternative ways of thinking, people do respond. And we worked with people who were not so radicalized, and we worked with people who were highly radicalized. So from my own personal view, I have never seen anyone go back once the relationships have been built. However, I also want to talk about, so at that level, but when you're talking about this large scale things and the impacts that are pouring in, be it religious organizations or militant organizations or state level policies, so certain things, I think we have to address the very basic. When we look at our constitution and when it says all citizens are equal, but we do realize that some are more equal than others in so many ways. So these basic debates, so community level, these are very good examples. And because it's my own personal example, to date, I've never seen anyone go back. I've always seen positive results, and they are still sustaining. It is how we break down prejudices at one level, but then coming back to this, to the state level also and constitutional level, we have to address that when we say equal citizens, then the implications of what equal citizens mean, and access to the justice system. I think this aspect is absolutely important. And we have to see, when we say the state, now who is the state? And that is why democratic institutions have to be strengthened, because that voice, because at the end of that day, and given these new laws, and all this debate of PICA and all, like this freedom of expression, in terms of being responsible citizens, all these debates, this ownership thing. So who actually is the state? And who participates in the decision making? And this is something that the country is struggling with, and we need to continuously build up to that. Other than that, this whole debate of religious, like the religious people have become more stronger. So we have to define a certain class of religious people have become more stronger. It's like 97% are Muslims and the others are different faiths. So all of them are religious, but then, so is there politics connected to these groups? How come one group becomes more stronger than the other? And then one group begins to fade and then another group pops up. Dr. Nayyar has given some examples of, Tehreek-e-Labbaik, and these are groups, then they come up and the others groups fade away and then they come up again. So there is politics at hand over here. And I feel that these discourses and debates will have to continue. And there are some brave people who do that, individuals, but groups and civil society at this level, so be it from a human rights perspective, be it from legal perspectives, be it from interfaith perspectives, but not in isolation, because all of them are integrated. Economics, politics, state policies. So what is the state trying to promote? What policy is it following? And to which extent it wants to follow? And these are decisions where the ordinary citizen needs to take part. And as I said, it's not that all citizens are equal, but we do know that some are more equal than others, and this has to be addressed.
Thank you for that, Jennifer Saiba. I think that puts a positive spin on some of this debate. Saroop, what solutions in your view work and what hasn't worked, and what options can we not avail at all?
I think in terms of what hasn't worked, the current status quo is not working, which is something that I mentioned earlier, is the idea to kick the can down the road, to cede space, to deal with it later, to deal with it kinetically, look at these things as law and order problems. That's not working. And even that was to begin with. As I said, the problems with the laws themselves, there are problems with how they're implemented, but they're bigger problems, which is that now if you have to come to terms with the fact that after state policies, laws, education system, politics, you now have a significant part of society which believes, I mean, which might not, most of them are peaceful, but they believe in the legitimacy of exclusion, and that's a problem. And what would work, and what I think has worked over, throughout history, is the idea of building, for a country like Pakistan, federation, diverse country like Pakistan, to idea of building a sense of citizenship, sense of national identity, which, as I said, is not only based on, or not primarily based on, one factor, in this case, religion. And we're seeing more and more of that. And what that is leading to is a dangerous mix. I think it's very dangerous, where we have the exclusion, the isolation, at times xenophobia of the past, some of the hate speech and incitement to violence of the past. We're now meeting the globalized new technology of the modern world, which is to what there is. It's not to say modernity is not affecting, but it is modernity of the tools of exclusion, of hatred, and not modernity in the sense of the values of modernity. And we're seeing this in India, we're seeing this around the world, where it has become easier. The cost of spewing hate now has gone down, which is far be it for me to suggest or endorse any censorship or the measures that we've seen recently, which are not meant to which are not meant to counter this, which are not meant to counter incitement to violence and hate speech, which might counter unpleasant speech, the speech that authorities find unpleasant. But so that is the challenge of building a sense of nationhood, building a sense of national identity, regional identities, linguistic identities, ethnic identities. So you have to be, there is a pluralistic ethos that needs to be embraced.
Thank you for that, Saroop. I think there's very many solutions that you touched upon. Dr. Nayyar Saab, if you could identify one or two interventions that you feel are important for resolving this issue.
I agree with Saroop that the state has to emphasize that citizenship is equal, and that all citizens have equal rights, and therefore there is no permission to diminish anybody's rights, legal rights, and so on. However, I think the more important thing is that the state it can be done in law. I think it is already there. It may already be there. The point is the state will have to sort of enforce it. And if the state fails to enforce it, then nobody cares about what law says. This is precisely what is happening nowadays. And therefore, and I think the state also falters at another point, where what it says is in the Constitution, at one place you say that all citizens are equal. At other places you say that the religion of its state religion is this and this, and if the state religion is this and this, and if you have a religious state that you declare, then you automatically distinguish between different citizens. Therefore, a state will have to actually redefine itself also. We'll have to sit down and think very deeply about the kind of difficulty it has led itself into. In terms of laws, in terms of implementation of laws, and in terms of behavior. I put the entire blame on, not on people, but on the state. And I think this, if the state starts to act properly, many of these things can be rectified.
Thank you, sir. Jennifer Saiba, one or two interventions that you think can resolve this issue?
I think one is, of course, strengthening our democratic values. That whole institution of democracy and how governments come and how governments go. So the democratic principles, and within political parties, of looking at their framework of where they can play a part. So it's civil society, it's citizens, a state, but it's also political parties of how they can play, since they have followings. If anyone can match a following with the religious parties, it's the political parties. And how, the will, do they have that will, and do they have that courage? And how are they going to find spaces within themselves? Because if there's the religious groups, then there's the political parties that can match from that angle. And the constitutional debates need, because within that framework about this equal citizenship, and then the strengthening of the institutions that is laid down, because that's where the citizens can go to. And then it is about building relationships from civil society organizations, and it's the states, as we are citizens of it, of building that relationship with your neighbor through smaller groups, and providing the opportunities of economic development, social development. All these factors have to be put in place. And it is this whole, our judiciary, our judicial system, our legal system that needs, where citizens feel that they are protected and where they can go and access to all these aspects. But the ordinary citizen, as I said, I have personal examples, and not one of them is negative, where we can also play our part and in trying to build, because at that person to person level, but that is not enough, because it's all integrated, and we need a horizontal and vertical approach to all aspects. So all aspects of the state and the individual citizen also has to be played out.
Thank you. Saroop, would you like to come in with one or two brief interventions that you think will work and also to prevent violence? I can see that Jennifer Saiba is raising her hand. Jennifer Saiba, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just one aspect. I think the education curriculum, that is an important aspect. It's not just because of this debate, but even when I was very young, I feel that because our education system is ideology driven, and then whose ideology is coming. Education should be for education, for knowledge, for observation. So I think this whole debate is absolutely important.
It's a valid point. Saroop, over to you.
I think the one concrete recommendation would be, as I said, there is of dealing with the law, not all of them, because the canvas is so broad. In just as Tasaddaq Hussain Jilani's 2014 judgment, which deals with a whole host of these issues of the idea, and interprets the freedom of religion, conscience and belief guarantee in the Pakistan constitution. So I think starting point would be to start with implementation for that. And second, there is, I think the first step should be reform of the criminal justice system, of the entire legal justice system, at all three levels, at the levels of the police, level of the lawyers, the government, prosecutors. Because changing the laws is an important first step, should be undertaken. And the second, it should be accompanied by sensitizing the entire justice system to the idea of equality, to the values of diversity and pluralism.
Thank you to all our participants. I think it's evident that there is agency within communities and people, but the greatest agent here is the state. And I think there is alignment in the views of all speakers that the responsibility as well as the historical trend line that has been created lies with the state. It is the greatest actor here with the greatest resources to resolve problems. But as one of our participants said, does the resolve to fix this issue, or the interest or the will to do away with extremism, does that exist within the state? Or is the state a constant beneficiary of the confusion and violence and madness that plays out in Pakistan's streets? I don't think we're able to resolve this in a conversation. There are very many, this conversation has packed in many, many policy domains, as well as things to think about, as well as many, many recommendations. But I hope that this feeds into a larger conversation out seeking solutions on how rid Pakistan of violence and extremism and radicalization among its youth and other population cohorts. I thank you very much for listening in, and I thank all our participants for giving us time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.